Jesus Christ. Welcome back to this week's paper review, where we look at the Sikhistan Journal for Strength Conditioning Research that people have submitted to us. We don't really have any. What's the value for the impact of a journal? What's that number?
Yeah,
we don't have one.
There's a grading system, and we don't have a grade.
We don't have
yet.
it. Yeah, we're not acknowledged pricks. This week's paper is on something that is kind of a contentious issue with certain groups of people, more so in the CrossFitters realm of training. We don't see it so much with, for example, maybe powerlifters and weightlifters, but mostly with a kind of a CrossFit group. We see active recovery and passive recovery being a thing. We also see it a lot with, I suppose, what we would call like real athletes, as in people who are just non-strength sport athletes. That's not a jab at anyone. We used to say it a lot in the early days of the channel, but we haven't said it in a while. So just kind of people like field sports athletes, paid athletes, professional athletes. We do see a lot of this kind of active passive or this active recovery thing being thrown around. We did one a long time ago in a study, and it showed that I think there was a little bit of negative or slightly null to negative results in terms of active recovery doing anything. Basically, it did nothing positive for people's recovery from training. So this week's paper is titled Molecular Differences in Skeletal Muscle After 1 Week of Active versus Passive Recovery from High Volume Resistance Training. And there's a lot of different authors on this one, which is interesting because a lot of lab work went into this too, I'd imagine. So this is coming out as from Alabama, Georgia, LA, holy shit, Pennsylvania State University, Lindenwood University. Lindenwood, they do a little bit of weightlifting, interesting. University of Kentucky, Alabama again, and
Alabama.
Yep, that's it. So basically they wanted to see, after a 6-week training program, then a separate 1-week deload, what were the difference molecularly, and through a variety of different tests, what difference did active and passive recovery make on the deload week. So we had a very, very intensive 6-week training program. We had 30 men. Now, interestingly with this one, they had quite a reasonable level of kind of entry, a barrier for entry for the program, and they picked at least 1.5 or greater times bodyweight squat. And so most of them had something like 1.7 times bodyweight squat, which is quite a decent group. For
a scientific cohort.
Yeah. So usually with this, when they say squat, they mean to about parallel. So I'd imagine this range from probably somewhere around parallel to all the way down to a full depth squat, for example. But still, quite well trained people. Now, some of these probably aren't really 1.5 times bodyweight squats. It's probably 1.5 times bodyweight squat to a bench, for example. It would just be very surprising if a study was able to get 30 different people who could all legitimately squat like 1.5 or 150, 160, 170 or something like that,
Yeah.
But anyway, so we still had a decent group of people trained. They all needed at least 1 year's experience. So what they went through basically was a very, very intensive 6-week training program. It started off with some testing to establish their 3RM, which then they extrapolated to calculate their 1RM, and then they used this to start with the loading. So the loading actually started with 10 by 10 sets. So they had a variety of different exercises. They had barbell back squats, barbell bench press, barbell overhead press, barbell stiff-legged deadlift, and supinated machine grip lat pull downs. So they had a very intensive 6-week program. It started off with 10 sets of 10 repetitions per week per exercise, and then accumulated sets over a 6-week period. So they kind of did reverse kind of progression, typically what we'd see, and ended up with 32 sets of 10 per exercise, standardized at 60% of an estimated 1RM over the week. So a lot of work went into this. There's more details with the program, but you get the idea. You don't need to know those particular details. So they train 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday and Friday. On, for example, the Wednesday they replaced the bench press with the overhead press. So quite standard compound movements, I'd say. That feels cringy to say compound movements.
Why?
I don't know, but it felt kind of cringy, but that's what they were.
The internet has robbed you of that term. Like functional training. Can't use that anymore.
So they had quite a decent training program, solid exercises in terms of hypertrophy effect and looking for meaningful effect, and looking for, you're likely to get some kind of physiological response to these bigger and heavier exercises, and they certainly did enough sets.
Jesus Christ, yeah.
Certainly
there's plenty of volume there.
Plenty of volume.
I don't think anyone could say it wasn't a training program that you'd need some recovery after.
Yeah, you definitely need some recovery after this. So they went through that. They had their 6 weeks, and then in the last week, in the 7th week, we had a deload week for them, and so their passive recovery was either doing nothing for the week, or the active recovery did 15% of the volume they did. So very, very, very light, but same movements for that week. Now, I know some people would say active recovery typically would be like a once a week thing, but they're looking for in terms of a whole week section. So if you just stop training for a week, you still get a positive adaptation. Which, actually, hang on, sorry, they did pre-post and testing, so they did a lot of different molecular testing, hormonal testing. They did POMS, they did mood states, they did barbell velocity. So on the Friday of the deload week, everyone came in and did some of the testing. So quite a rigorous gambit of testing went on after that, which Fitz is now going to take us through those results. Tell us the results, Fitz.
What were the results? So yeah, as Garth said, a fairly serious battery of tests right across multiple like physiological, psychological, performance outcomes. Active versus passive groups were kind of compared, and you get a group by time group by time interaction. Let's just break down a few of these firstly. So zero differences are said to be the same on self-reported mood states. As far as I know, they use POMS, which is profile of mood states. Very standard inventory of psychological questions. I think they're looking at, in this study, they were looking at all the negative answers. So the way the POMS works is you have a number of questions that are specifically designed for lower mood states, and a number of questions that are designed for higher mood states like vigor, happiness, positive mental state. Basically, they're looking at negative mood state, which would be kind of one of the main aspects we'd look at in a recovery setting. No difference here between active and passive recovery. Next thing they look at is barbell squat velocity. No difference between active and passive groups in that. So the group who did nothing for the week were moving the bar as fast as the group who were doing some active recovery for the group. That was measured with a Tendo unit. So it's pretty accurate measurement, for barbell velocity. You don't need anything major. Body composition, everyone's fat-free mass, so their like lean tissue mass, increased during the study, but no difference between the groups. Again, you wouldn't really expect that to change though, from the fact that they went through the same training program and then it was just 1 week of a difference. You wouldn't really expect alterations there in a week. Then you have molecular and histological values relating to skeletal muscle hypertrophy. No changes between those two groups, and that's probably the most important aspect of this study, is those molecular values. That's the main thing people talk about in the active recovery world, is that they're keeping the muscle tissue in a more positive environment for hypertrophy or for adaptation. Yet in this study we don't see that coming out. Next thing then is molecular markers relating to skeletal muscle hypertrophy are similar following active to passive, although they say they're noteworthy. So they do note that they're noteworthy. Basically, the issue with this study was the fact that really good intervention, really good values, like sort of battery of tests is really, really comprehensive. The issue they have is that recovery week probably isn't long enough for actual changes to have occurred. So although they're not noting any significant differences between the groups, they are noteworthy in the values of those kind of molecular markers, and more than likely an additional study will be carried out with the same kind of paradigms, the same restrictions, facilitators and constraints, but they might change that recovery paradigm a small bit. No changes in FS or FCSA, so that's fiber cross-sectional area. So that's the actual thickness of the fibers. As far as I know, they did a muscle biopsy. They're also doing ultrasounds. They had multiple ways of kind of quantifying the amount of tissue there and multiplying or deducing the cross-sectional area of each muscle fiber. That's really what you're looking for if you're looking for a physiological marker that will change, is that fiber cross-sectional area. So a lot of the time, like take your vastus lateralis, the outside of your quad, what you're looking for is like you won't get hyperplasia of muscle fibers, but you will get hypertrophy of individual fibers. So you should be able to see a change in that fiber cross-sectional area. And as far as I know, there was a change in fiber cross-sectional area over the course of the intervention or over the course of the training period It's just there wasn't a change between active and passive groups over the course of the week. The last thing then is commentary on active versus passive deloading suggests better outcomes for active deloading, but data are mixed. So this is one thing they quoted. I think it's probably important to note it here, is that a lot of recent research talks about this active recovery as being a positive thing, particularly in hypertrophy studies. But the data in this study really doesn't back it up, and the data in the quoted studies here doesn't back it up either. It's just kind of all up in the air at the moment.
So I think there's a couple of implications from this. So typically when people talk about active or passive recovery, when they're saying active recovery, they mean, going for a hike and smoking weed up a mountain. That's active recovery is usually seen as like cardio for most athletes, because we see that as, no one really thinks active recovery is 4 sets of 10 on the squat the next day. I know some people do a little bit of kind of like movement stuff.
Just like get moving around.
Just get moving around, get the blood flow, even though if the blood flowing, you'd be dead like. But so, you do see people like sitting on a bike for 5 or 6K. I think like the main implication of this is you're probably not doing anything negative if you are doing some active recovery in terms of training. Now this is only focused on hypertrophy training, so looking at gaining muscle mass. So this is a deload as opposed to a taper. So for any of you guys watching, a lot of you are probably more strength based. So this might not be the best idea to do if you are looking at tapering for a new 1RM, for example. So taking a whole week off and seeing and retesting for your 1RM probably wouldn't be the best idea. So in that case, they'd be looking at kind of maintenance of skill. So that'd be a taper, would be very, very different to a deload. But if you're primarily focused on, if you're in a hypertrophy phase of your training and you're going from a section of your training where you are doing your hypertrophy phase and then you're going into your high volume phase, or you're going into maybe your kind of strength phase, then a week off in the middle certainly looks like it could be a nice little option, just where you just calm down for a little bit. It's not going to have any negative impact on your training. If you've gone from very, very non-specific work and you're going into your strength stuff, that week off could be very, very useful in terms of just chilling out. So if you feel like you've had a very intense hypertrophy phase and you've something planned, or you feel like you need just a week off from training before your strength phase, then it looks like you've got the green light to go in terms of you're not going to lose any skeletal muscle, and it's likely you're just going to keep the adaptions going from that previous intense few weeks of training. Similarly, in that regard, if you are doing a lot of hypertrophy training, for example, and probably very similarly strength training, if you suddenly have to take a week off for whatever reason and you didn't get injured and wasn't a health related issue, you just had life forced you to take several days off, I think it's helpful to know that you're safe in the knowledge that your body didn't suddenly shit the bed and go, fuck, this strength, I don't need this anymore, I don't need this muscle, I don't need this new sets and reps. Because it does happen a lot where people ask, I stopped, say for example, the powerlifting program, I was on block 2, week 2, and in the middle of the week I had to go to Miami to meet my drug dealer, and then I couldn't train for a week. And so you came back to training, they're like, where should I take off? And typically just restarting that next week with that break, or the previous week, is usually totally fine for terms of strength training. But you're going to talk about skill, are you? Skill acquisition. You talk about skill. I think that's a nice little...
So
I'm going to catch the ball. There we go.
Here's the talking ball. Anyway, so Gerf's talking there about like bodybuilder training, why it mightn't be a bad thing if you're like working all summer long to get jacked before you go to Ibiza or wherever you go on your holiday.
Mykonos,
Greece, Cancun,
yeah,
wherever you go, right? So it's not, there's going to be no negative effects from not training during the week. Now there's probably loads of negative effects from the other stuff you're doing during the week, but
Coke.
That's none of our business. What this is important for though as well, when we look at the opposite side of that coin and more the performance side, more the kind of motor cognition side of things, is are we going to still be able to practice movements and practice this skill we use in our sport and not have a negative outcome? And it appears as though here, when we look at active recovery, like what they're doing in their active recovery, it appears as though we can have some amount of exercise, some amount of training during that week and we'll have no negative effects. So it's not like you're perplexed by what's going on out there. What's happening?
I don't know. It seems to have been a raid or something. Oh my god, someone must not be squatting 200 kilos. What the fuck is going on?
They promised us they would be. Oh my god, what's happening? There's a motorcade.
Holy shit.
The important thing we're seeing here is that this study would suggest that we're going to be able to have some amount of kind of active movement during the week we're going to be able to practice our skills. Now, if you're a weightlifter and you were kind of worried about, I've just done this really high capacity block, I need to deload, so obviously a deload is necessary. Will I still be able to practice movements at kind of moderate intensities? This paper would suggest yes, you can. I think in terms of like the research moving forward, and probably what we're going to see in the next number of years, is we'll see more studies like this. So better conducted studies, large batteries of tests that are very, very rigorous in their methods. So like actually getting muscle biopsies, actually doing DEXA scans, getting all of this high quality data, and then an alternative view of active versus passive recovery. So obviously this is just one paradigm that they covered. There are multiple different ways of being active in your recovery. So yeah, there's definitely like negatives and positives to it. I think very much so, if you're like a performance driven athlete and you're looking at this, it does allow you to kind of say like, okay, there'd be no benefit to me doing active recovery, but I can still practice it without kind of throwing all the toys out of the pram.
Yeah, I think like for people watching, it's really, if you had to take that week off and it's strength training primarily and it's not a high skill thing, then you'd be safe in the knowledge that if it's hypertrophy or strength training, you're going to be fine.
Yeah.
Very, very, like you've got no issues, no gains lost. In terms of like highly skilled sports, maybe like weightlifting or something like that, it's very likely, we know it to be detrimental. Like a full week off wouldn't be great, but if it's after a hypertrophy phase, something like that, then you're fine. You know, if you're in the latter stages, week 6 of 7 in your weightlifting peak, that week off before your last heavy week wouldn't be ideal.
No.
But for all other cases, it seems like it's some useful knowledge to have for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching. Let us know if you like these paper reviews. Sorry for the interruption.